Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and here are 25 more classic books you can read in one day. Hey, so welcome back. I have another video with 25 books you can read in a day. This video is actually going to be half books that I've read and half that are still on my to be read list. So in addition to pointing out the difference there, because I can't in good conscience really recommend books that I haven't read myself, I'm also in the description box below going to put stars next to the classic books that work really well for things like the AP literature exam. All of these classics are definitely worth trying out, but some of them are going to work for that exam and other ones are not going to be accepted as readily. So you can look at the description box below for the difference there. So without further ado, here are 25 more classic books that you can read in one day. I'm going to kick things off with a personal favorite, and that is Beowulf by an anonymous writer. One of the most famous translations is from Seamus Heaney, but there are a lot of good translations out there. Yeah, take a look and see it. It's a really exciting Anglo-Saxon epic poem about a guy named Beowulf who has to face a variety of monsters, but it's written in this beautiful style, and really it's the monsters that are the heart of the story. They represent so much of what's wrong with the world and how one fights against it. So yeah, Beowulf is shorter than something like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and it is equally as beautiful in my opinion. All right, number 2 is The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams. It's been a while since I've read this play, but it's about a family in the 1930s who is going through a lot of turmoil and issues. So it's one man's memory of his family experiences in the 30s. Check it out if that sounds interesting to you. Number 3 is The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Just the adjective Kafka-esque means something that is pretty twisted and surreal and labyrinthine and things like that. So Metamorphosis is about a guy who wakes up one morning and he is a bug. That's the premise here. So he goes through his day as a bug. So it's very unsettling. It's kind of funny, but it's mostly just about like how horrible modern society is. So yeah, The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Number 4 is A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. I'm an equal opportunity classics reader. I think that children's classics are classics. They're classics for a reason, and so I do not discriminate. This one is perhaps a tiny bit longer, not really, than some of the others, but it's a really weird sci-fi-esque adventure that this brother and sister go on in this story. Number 5 is another Shirley Jackson I had in my first 25 books you can read in a day list. The Haunting of Hill House, which honestly I like a little bit more than this one I'm recommending now. That's why that one made the first list. But this one's interesting as well. It's called We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And it's a very similar vibe. It's people who exist in this castle and you're wondering to yourself, are they actual people? Are they alive? You know, what's the catch here with these sisters in this castle? It's a very weird and once again unsettling sort of book, which you would expect from something written by Shirley Jackson, who's a master at that sort of wait a second, something's wrong type of horror. All right, so speaking of horrifying things, although it's not technically horror, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. This is an ancient Greek play that actually won a lot of awards in its day. Oedipus Rex means Oedipus the king. If you've heard about the Oedipal complex, gets its name from this. So going into this play, most of the original audience would have known the twist, and if you know it in advance, it actually makes the play better, unlike most works of literature, which I think are better if you do not spoil the ending. But since this one really depends on a lot of just terrible, funny, horrible just timing as you understand the truth, that will come out at the end, I will just tell you. So it's about a king named Oedipus, who's dealing with a plague upon the land, and he's trying to figure out what it is that has caused all of this curse, essentially. And it turns out that there was a prophecy when he was younger that said, one day you will murder your father and marry your mother. And he said, no, absolutely, I will not. He left. He didn't see either one. Well, he didn't grow up around them anyway, so he didn't know what they looked like. And so it turns out that the prophecy, the fate that was fated for him, is true, and he realizes he is the cause of all of the turmoil because of the unnatural, horrible thing that he has done by fulfilling both parts of that prophecy. When I was a freshman in high school and read this, I did not like it because how horrible is that premise. When I read it again in my 20s, I actually thought that the timing was brilliant. There are all these little turns of phrase and these little hints as to what's going to come up. And so anyway, yeah, that is Oedipus Rex. All right, the next one up is The Gambler by Dostoevsky. This book that I'm holding up has actually two shorter novels, The Double and The Gambler. I just chose my favorite of the two. The Double is not bad, but The Gambler really stuck with me in a way that The Double did not. The Gambler is, I don't want to say based on Dostoevsky's life, because that's an oversimplification, but Dostoevsky himself was addicted to gambling, and so he describes that affliction with a lot of just visceral power, so much so that I've heard, at least, that some psychology programs in universities will require The Gambler as reading to understand the psychology of somebody who is addicted to gambling, because it's so vividly portrayed in that story. All right, next up is another play. I decided to add several plays in here because they do tend to be shorter. This one is No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre, which is it's a surreal sort of play where the famous line, "Hell is other people," comes from, which gives you a sense of what that story is going to be. So if you like things like Waiting for Godot or something like that, then you will, I think, absolutely love No Exit. I personally like No Exit more than things like Endgame, but it's along that same kind of despairing line. Number 9, we are going, I know we're hopping all around, but I kind of like that, mixing things up. You can choose one of these. One of these is bound to appeal to you. So next up is the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, which is the primary text of Taoism. So because this is a religious text, essentially, this is not something that would go well in the AP literature exam. So again, I'm going to put those stars next to the ones that I would recommend for that exam. But it is a fascinating read. It's beautiful. It's written in a poetic style. And even if you are yourself not a Taoist, I think that there is a lot of wisdom and about just living in concert with the natural world that you can get from that work. The next one is a book that I read in college. It stuck with me. It's weird. It's a postmodern book. It's called The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. So The Crying of Lot 49, it has a lot of wordplay. It's essentially about this woman named Oedipa. So there's a reference to Oedipus just in her name, Oedipa Mas, and she is the executor of this fortune. Some people have died and she needs to take care of the belongings, and it's another unsettling one. So if that sounds interesting to you, go for it. I remember flying through it much more quickly than some of the other modern and postmodern American lit that I was assigned in college. I found it more interesting. So try it out if that sounds good to you. Next up is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Again, my favorite George Orwell is probably 1984 rather than Animal Farm, but it's a similar message with Animal Farm, just with animals. So all animals are created equal, but some are created more equal than others. You have these really memorable characters in the pigs who start controlling everything, and this lovely naive horse that I just can't forget. So it's all a parable against Stalinism, much like 1984 in a grimmer, more human way was a parable against that sort of Stalinist state as well. So Animal Farm, it is not a children's book, although I've seen it in the children's section at Goodwill. I'm like, oh no, don't do that. It's really grim, as many of these suggestions are. But yeah, Animal Farm. Okay, number 12 is once again another play. This one is Dr. Faustus, or The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus is the whole name, by Christopher Marlowe. There are actually several versions of Dr. Faustus that are out there. If you want to mix up the premise is the same, the endings are different, which is pretty fascinating. Christopher Marlowe is somebody who lived at the same time as Shakespeare, but then as he was on the rise, Marlowe that is, Shakespeare kind of eclipsed him, and then Marlowe met an untimely end in a bar fight about which there is a lot of speculation, but in any case, Dr. Faustus, the premise of all the Faustus plays out there is that there is a professor named Dr. Faustus who sells his soul, who basically trades his soul for the to be able to control a demon called Mephistopheles for a number of years and have like absolute power through the devil, basically. So I'm not going to tell you what ending you get with Christopher Marlowe's version, but if you want a different ending, then you could go with Goethe. He wrote a play called just Faust, and that one has a different ending. Okay, number 13. Number 13 is a Jane Austen book. Most of the Jane Austen novels are too long, I would say, to put on this list. But my favorite Jane Austen to read is Northanger Abbey, and it is one of her shorter novels. So Northanger Abbey, it's about a girl who reads too many like gothic, melodramatic novels, and she has the opportunity to go to Northanger Abbey, which is owned by the family of this man, this lovely, friendly man that she meets. But because she's been so affected by these melodramatic, terrible stories of kidnappings and ghosts and whatnot, she is incredibly stressed out and starts fabricating these stories about the Abbey and getting quite afraid. So I think it's a hoot. I really like both of the leads, and it is one that I actually really enjoyed reading. I like a lot of Jane Austen movies, but as far as reading Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey and then I would say Emma are the two that I genuinely enjoyed reading myself. So take that with, you know, as you want to. If you love all of Jane Austen, more power to you, but I'm just trying to, you know, be as honest as possible, I guess. All right, number 14 is The Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell. It's a survival story. It's about a girl who survives alone on this island by using her wits and her strength. So it is a castaway story. It's beautiful. It uses beautiful language, but there is essentially one character throughout the majority of the story. So just be prepared for that to be the case. Number 15 is The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. It is a classic. It is a political classic, and typically I don't read or enjoy any sort of political books, but this one is where you get the famous concept of, you know, how it's better to be feared than loved. But that's an oversimplification of what Machiavelli is doing in The Prince. He actually has some very, very workable ideas. You can see where some of his concepts come from, and then you can see where some of it gets pretty cutthroat as well. But it's a fairly short read, and it's interesting to see where some of these ideas came from rather than just hearing about them secondhand. I would say the same thing about Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. It's very interesting to see where some of these ideas originated and how people took them to, you know, very negative, like extra negative places after the fact as well. All right, so number 16 is Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare. So again, just a hard left. It's another play, yes, it's one of Shakespeare's shorter plays, and it's actually funny. A lot of these books that I'm listing today are very negative. They are sad or unsettling or surreal in a sort of Salvador Dali way. But Much Ado About Nothing is not. It is comedy about these two people. The banter is crackling and they secretly are in love with each other, but because they hurt each other in the past, they are really upset at one another and they're unwilling to get drawn into a relationship again until their friends get involved. So yeah, this one is a good time. Okay, so that is the end of the books that I have personally read. The rest of these are on my list to read as well, so I'll just kind of introduce you to what they are, and you can of course make up your own mind if they sound interesting to you or not. Number 17 is The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I am a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes. Basically any movie version. I've read all of the novels, I've read all of the short stories, huge fan. But he wrote more than just Sherlock Holmes. In fact, he was not the biggest fan of his own character after he had written a bit about him, but that's a story for another day. So The Lost World is an adventure story about people who go to this, they go through time. I don't exactly know, but there are dinosaurs, there's adventure. It is a ripping tale, according to The Guardian. And it's by Arthur Conan Doyle, whom I really enjoy, so I intend to read that one day. Number 18 is The Call of the Wild by Jack London. I've read some short stories by Jack London, like To Build a Fire, and it's pretty stark, pretty dark and kind of cold. As I'm filming this, it is the summertime, and so I'm not really into cold stories. However, The Call of the Wild is obviously a classic. Man and His Dog. I believe it's the Alaskan wilderness, and one of these days I will inevitably read it. Number 19. Number 19 actually wasn't on my radar to want to read it until recently, but now I do. It's Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. As much as I love Audrey Hepburn, I do not really like the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. You can like it, that's fine. It's not my cup of tea. However, I recently read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which I know is a very different kind of book, but I was super impressed with his writing. I found it gripping. I flew through that book, which is much longer than Breakfast at Tiffany's. So yeah, I intend to give that one a try one day. Number 20 is Anthem by Ayn Rand. I like dystopian stories that kind of project into the future and give this extreme version of what might be. You know, 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451. I have to be in the mood for it, but sometimes they're just my favorite types of books, and I've never read Anthem, which is shorter than any of those, and it's like this collective, like everyone has to refer to themselves as we, as opposed to I. There's no individuality allowed. So it sounds like an interesting thought experiment, and so I intend to dive into that one day. Next, number 21 is Night by Elie Wiesel. I looked up how to pronounce it. I hope I'm doing that correctly. I do try my best here, but yeah, Night. It is story of his experiences in the Holocaust. I've read several Holocaust books by survivors, and every time I do, I'm so emotionally shaken from the experience that I have to take a long break. But I have actually never read Night. All of the students at the high school where I taught read Night in history class, and I could see them carrying it around with them, like they were actually diving into that book in a way that they didn't always engage with some of the other works. So I'm sure it's a fascinating read, and it is, again, very short. You can read it in a day if you put your mind to it. I know some of these are borderline as far as reading in a day. We all read at different speeds. I'm kind of a mid-speed reader myself. Many of these books would take me more than a day, but probably no more than 3, full disclosure. Next on my to-be-read list is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Once again, I looked up the pronunciation of that name. I hope it's as accurate as I can get. So Things Fall Apart. I have had my eye on this book for a long time, actually, and I have not read it yet. I haven't read enough African literature. I've read, obviously, a lot of British literature. That is my wheelhouse. That's what I have my degree in. I love it. But I want to expand my horizons more, and this seems like a really obvious place to begin reading more African literature because of how well regarded this story is. All right, next, this would be number 23, I believe, is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. I love a bit of spookiness, and this one is essentially a long short story. And I've never read it. So one of these days I need to read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow about this ghostly writer by Washington Irving. Number 24 is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I keep hearing from so many people how great this book is, and it's been on my list, but it's started to move closer to the top. Yeah, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the name of the mad doctor who creates the monster, and it's apparently much more philosophical than a lot of the pop culture versions of Frankenstein would lead you to believe about purpose and love and nature versus nurture and some of these things that you wouldn't necessarily think would show up in a book about Dr. Frankenstein. And then finally, number 25 is A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. It is again a short memoir of his time in Paris in the 1920s, where there were a lot of expats. The Fitzgeralds, there we go, spent some time there as well. And I hear it's really beautiful, and that's not a word that I hear connected to Hemingway's style very often. So I'm curious. I wrote Laertes, a Hamlet retelling, which is set in Paris in the 1920s, so it'd be interesting to hear a first-hand account of these writers in Paris in the 1920s from somebody who was there. So there you go, 25 more classics you can read in a day. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a tip through the super thanks down below, or check out my website, carly-stevens.com. I just opened a resource store for English teachers, English students, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm really excited about there in that store. You can find all of that, the links down below, as well as those stars next to the classics that I think would be a great fit for the AP Literature exam. All right, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next week.